Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time you are watching this video. I am Professor Ruben Ramos, and this is another asynchronous class on superhero comic books in nowadays society. On our last synchronous class, we have stopped right here on page 105 and tried to explain how the perception of time takes place in comics. Let's move on and increase our, or raise better, or enlarge even better our picture here for you to follow. So, comics readers are also conditioned by other media in the real time of everyday life to expect a very linear progression, just a straight line from point A to point B. But is that necessary? What MacLeod is trying to state here is that if this is the only way to perceive time or even to transmit the idea of time passage in a comic book. Let's check it out. For now, these questions are the territory of games and strange little experiments. But viewer participation is on the verge of becoming an enormous issue in other media. How comics addresses this issue, or fails to, could play a crucial part in defining the role of comics in the new century. Time will tell. And please remember, this book was originally published in 1993 or 4, so late 20th century. As mentioned earlier, time and space in the world of comics are closely linked. As a result, so too are the issues of time and motion. As discussed in chapter 3, motion in comics is produced between panels by the mental process called closure. So, in the gutter of each panel or sequence, panels, better saying, we have the assumption of time or of motion, is where the motion sense is produced and becomes intelligible to us readers. Usually by transition types 1, 2, but let's not get into that again. Despite comics' 3,000 year story, it wasn't until Topfer's mid 1800s doodlings that specific motions were portrayed in comics in the now familiar panel-to-panel form. Let's take a look into this short comic. How, in bright and witty society, one should be seated in order to talk theaters, casinos, and the latest nonsense in general. How, if a superior makes a joke, one jumps up with a roar of laughter. Within a few years, however, motion was a hot topic indeed. If you take a closer look into this Olympic sport being performed here, I'm not sure how's the name of this sport in English. I will say the Portuguese version translated, it would be something like race with obstacles or running with obstacles. I'm not sure if that's the correct name. But if you take a closer look into this as a comic book, you will have both the perception of motion in motion and time passage with this athlete performing the movement. In the last quarter of the 19th century, it seemed like everyone was trying to capture motion through science. By 1880, inventors the world over knew that moving pictures were just around the corner. Everyone wanted to be first. My stroboscope is superior in every way to the obsolete zoetrope. Bah! My praxinoscope is better. Fools! My kinematoscope will show you. Ha! Child's play. They are but mere toys next to the awesome phantasmatrope. Frauds all. My zoopraxinoscope will. This this looks to me exactly like a supervillain comic book reading during the supervillain. I'm sorry, comic book gathering during the Silver Age, and we are going on the different ages of superhero comics when we finish Scott McCloud's reading. But this is the best example I could get. Is just changing the 19th century gentleman for supervillains, and you have Stan Lee and Jack Kirby story over here. Eventually, Thomas Edison, that old scallywag, filed the first patent on a process using strips of clear plastic photos, and film was off and running. If you are going to paint a world filled with motion, then be prepared to paint motion. Duchamp, more concerned with the idea of motion than the sensation, would eventually reduce such concepts as motion to a single line. So, according to Duchamp, this would represent motion. And we see in some comic books this form of representation. Of course, it's not the only one. These three other ones are very present examples, but neither one of them are the most used in comics. As the moving picture began its spectacular rise, a few of the more radical painters of the day explored the ideas that motion could be depicted by a single image or on canvas. The Futurists in Italy and Marcel Duchamp in France began the systematic decomposition of moving images in a static medium, like, for instance, Girl Running on a Balcony by Bala, or Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2 by Duchamp. It wasn't a bad idea. Duchamp soon moved on. The Futurists disbanded, and fine artists generally lost interest in this other type of moving picture. But throughout the same period, another medium less conspicuously had been investigating this same area. I'm sure you can all guess which medium I mean. Whack. From its earliest days, the modern comic has grappled with the problem of showing motion in a static medium. How do you show this aspect of time in an art where time stands still? And in comics, unlike painting, it was more than just a theoretical question. Smash! Though sequential art survived for many centuries without depicting motion, once the genie was out of the bottle, it was perhaps inevitable that more and more efficient means would be sought. At first, this search centered on multiple images in sequence, a very used resource in comics throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially superhero ones. Anybody who read a Spider-Man comic or even the Flash comics during those decades would see a sequence of images like this. But just as a single panel can represent a span of time through sound, smile, path, so too can a single panel represent a span of time through pictures. Somewhere between the futurist's dynamic movement and Duchamp's diagrammatic concept of movement lies comics' motion line, which could take this form or this form or even this form in three different examples. In the beginning, motion lines, or zip ribbons as some call them, were wild, messy, almost desperate attempts to represent the paths of moving objects through space. Sorry. Let me try to enlarge this so that you can have a better view. Right. Let's read. Die, fool, that you are, to match your strength against that of the redoubtable Brago the monk. Coming to, head, but I will climb this iceberg and then we'll show him what the great Brago. Heavens, my poor Brago, I knew that horrid old book would make you dream. Over the years, these lines became more refined and stylized, even diagrammatic. Arf, arf, swish. This is a classic example of on Popeye the Sailor Man. Eventually, in the hands of heroic fantasy artists like Bill Everett and Jack Kirby, we had an even more refined form of using lines to, in a style and diagrammatic way, perform movement, motion, and time passage. Those same lines became so stylized as to almost have a life and physical presence all their own. For example, in this Captain America frame over here, we have the swords and knives hitting a wall because the hero ducks, which is great. But you can almost believe that the weapons in the strap became alive because of the movement and the time passage notion over here. Same deal with the punch that this comic book character receives, and this mass being thrown to in an attempt to hit the dragon and save Thor over here. This is a very common movement with Thor in Marvel, especially when he does that chopper movement with his hammer, and he swings it in a cyclical way just before he flies. Very, very characteristic movement of Thor. Because of their ability to depict action with drama, such conspicuous action lines have been an American specialty for years. This reminds me so much of Flash comics, sometimes Superman too. In this approach, both the moving object and the backgrounds are drawn in a clear, articulated style, and the path of motion is imposed over the scene. If you take a look into this one here, McCloud is almost performing an Incredible Hulk's movement when he leaps from from building to building. He does those giant leaps of his and trespasses cities and deserts and great distances by jumping around. Other artists tried additional effects such as multiple images of the subject, attempting to involve the reader more deeply in the action. Like I told you before, this was a very common resource used with Spider Man, with The Flash, and with some key characters during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Still others, such as Marvel's Gene Colan, began incorporating photographic streaking effects with some intriguing results in the 60s and 70s. So it was common to find an alternative choice when an superhero comic book, especially a Marvel comic book artist, wanted to depict movement. He would go either as this or as this, such as Gene Colan used to do. Colan, who was also a film buff, was of course aware that when a camera's shutter speed is too slow to fully freeze a moving object's image, an interesting blurring effect occurs. For any one of you who has ever seen car race or motor race like Formula 1, Formula Truck, Formula Indy, or whatever, race with vehicles, in sort of speaking, if you freeze the image when the race is being taken care of, is being performed, you are going to find exactly these kinds of blurred lines or blurred effect with the vehicle. A car going at 60 miles per hour might look like this. But if the camera moves with the moving object, that object will remain focused while the background will now be straight. This is very common when we study physics in high school to understand the notion of speed and movement. This is very common for us to realize that all is relative, such as Albert Einstein used to say, and that it depends on our position and observation to understand how physics proceed in the world. American comics artists took little or no interest in this kind of photographic trickery. And in Europe, where motion lines were used only sparingly, it was likewise ignored. But in Japan, once again, a very different comics culture embraced this very different concept of motion as their own. Subjective motion, as I call it, operates on the assumption that if observing a moving object can be involving, being that object should be more so. Japanese artists, starting in the late 60s, began putting their readers in the driver's seat with panels like this. And starting in the mid-80s, a few American artists began to adopt the effect in their own work until by the early 90s it has become fairly common. So, if you take a closer look on these Japanese panels, is it perceivable? Can you realize, can you verify the motion, the movement, sense, and idea as readers or not? This is a question for you guys to answer me on our next synchronous class this Friday. I want you to take a good look on these and tell me if you really perceive the movement taking place on them. And we will go from this knowledge on. Thank you so much for watching. See you next class. Bye bye.